Stoic paradox: every foolish person is insane, explained. Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we explore philosophical concepts and extract practical advice that you can apply in your daily routine. I'm Dan, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. Today, we will delve into another intriguing Stoic paradox: every foolish person is insane. In our previous two episodes, we discussed other Stoic paradoxes derived from the writings of Marcus Tullius Cicero. For those who may not have caught all our episodes, we're nearing our 100th episode, and we're planning a celebratory event to mark this milestone. Now, back to the topic at hand. We have been examining these statements that might seem counterintuitive at first glance. Would you agree, Greg, that these are perspectives on the world that aren't immediately obvious? Absolutely, that's a great way to describe them. The Stoics presented these ideas, and many people reacted with confusion, thinking, "What on earth are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense at all." However, the Stoics would then clarify their thoughts, revealing how these statements actually hold meaning. That's what we'll be exploring today, whether this particular paradox makes sense or not. In a way, these paradoxes serve as educational tools or even as a form of marketing. They grab your attention with a bold statement, prompting you to think, "What do you mean by that?" This curiosity can lead to a deeper understanding. It's amusing to think of it as a marketing strategy because Cicero often criticized the Stoics for having profound philosophical insights but lacking in their ability to communicate them effectively. He believed that he could teach them a thing or two about presenting ideas compellingly. Cicero was not only a philosopher but also a skilled orator and statesman, and he felt that the Aristotelians had an edge over the Stoics in this regard. They understood the importance of rhetoric, not in a deceptive way, but in a manner that engages the audience and encourages them to embrace your ideas. Now, let's take a closer look at this paradox: every foolish person is insane. At first glance, this statement may not seem obvious. The interpretation of what we mean by foolish and insane is crucial here. Dan, I remember when I was younger and enjoyed partying, we wouldn't typically label someone as a fool, as that could lead to conflict. Instead, we might say, "Wow, that's crazy," when someone acted in a reckless or foolish manner. We used the term insane loosely, not implying that the person was genuinely mentally ill, but rather expressing our disbelief at their actions. It might be more accurate to say, "That decision doesn't make sense to me, I can't understand your reasoning." When we use the term insane, we are often suggesting that there is a significant flaw in someone's thought process, indicating that their reasoning is fundamentally misguided. Some individuals struggle to conform to conventional methods of engaging in activities, such as attending social gatherings. For instance, consider a person who decides to run around their home without clothes. While this behavior may seem outrageous, it certainly leaves a lasting impression. It's true that such actions can be memorable. However, before we delve deeper into this topic, it's worth noting a phenomenon that seems to occur with such extreme behaviors: the law of diminishing returns. When someone engages in an exceptionally wild or outrageous act, it raises the question of how they can possibly outdo themselves in the future. This often leads individuals down a path that may involve illegal activities or dangerous behavior, risking their safety and well-being. Each new generation appears eager to surpass the previous one in terms of outrageousness, yet there are limits to what can be achieved. Interestingly, my students, who are now 2 generations younger than I am, sometimes perceive me as an older individual who lacks an understanding of contemporary student life. Meanwhile, my peers and I often reminisce about the wild experiences we had, believing that today's youth are relatively tame in comparison. However, this perspective is understandable. Today's students face financial constraints, and any mistakes they make can be permanently documented online. Many actions that were once considered minor indiscretions in our youth are now criminalized and can have severe consequences, potentially ruining lives. In hindsight, I feel fortunate to have been part of the last generation that completed high school without smartphones. Although these devices were just emerging, few could afford them. We primarily used flip phones, and any videos captured were of such poor quality that they were hardly recognizable. Today, however, everything is easily accessible online. If someone were to capture footage of you engaging in questionable behavior, it would be difficult to deny your involvement, even if the image was unclear. Returning to the main topic, the Stoic philosophy presents intriguing ideas that resonate with contemporary issues, particularly regarding mental health and the way we perceive insanity and disorders. Our understanding of these concepts has evolved significantly since the time of the Stoics. This discussion is not limited to Stoicism, it also intersects with various other philosophical perspectives, such as Aristotelianism and Epicureanism, which also grapple with similar concerns. One critical question that arises is whether there exists a clear distinction between moral wrongdoing, often characterized by viciousness or bad intentions, and other issues such as ignorance or mental health disorders. Typically, society tends to show leniency towards individuals who may have acted poorly due to a lack of understanding, often labeling them as misguided rather than inherently bad. This raises further questions about accountability and the nature of human behavior. Ancient societies often perceived mental illness as a continuous spectrum rather than a clear-cut boundary. For instance, they might have viewed it as a gradual progression rather than an abrupt split, such as when someone is labeled crazy and then released from consequences. This perspective is still relevant today, as our own world's societal norms don't automatically absolve individuals of responsibility for their actions. In fact, the concept of scot-free is rarely applied. People may be incarcerated or subjected to institutionalization despite their intentions. The core question remains, does insanity persist as a universal condition, or is it shaped by individual circumstances? Consider the case of a man who engaged in child pornography and was diagnosed with a brain tumor. After removing the tumor, his addiction diminished, and he was released from prison. However, years later, the tumor returned, and he once again succumbed to his old habits. This pattern confirmed the possibility of recurrence, highlighting that mental health conditions can be complex and unpredictable. Some disorders, like bipolar disorder, are linked to chemical imbalances in the brain, which can manifest as manic or depressive episodes. Medications are often used to manage these symptoms, but they can also have side effects that impact daily life. For example, my uncle suffered from severe bipolar disorder. The medication helped stabilize his condition but also caused some drowsiness and reduced his energy. While the treatment was effective, it didn't eliminate his struggles entirely. Eventually, he found a balance that allowed him to function normally, though it required ongoing management. Without proper intervention, individuals with mental health challenges may end up in the criminal justice system, where they receive limited care. This raises ethical questions about the treatment of those with incorrect beliefs or behaviors. In the United States and other countries, prisons often house individuals with mental illnesses, even those who could otherwise lead productive lives. While some facilities offer specialized care, access to comprehensive treatment remains inconsistent, especially in less developed regions. The challenge lies in balancing accountability with compassion, ensuring that individuals with mental health issues are treated with dignity while addressing the root causes of their conditions. Let's consider the sheer number of individuals we're talking about here. I'm not entirely sure, but it's likely more than just a handful. In some places, you might actually find decent mental health treatment options available. However, if you're in a state like Alabama or anywhere in the Deep South, where there's a tendency to prioritize prisons over investing in them, the situation becomes quite dire. Even here in Wisconsin, while we do have numerous prisons, the conditions and outcomes are often far from ideal. This issue of incarceration is significant enough to warrant its own in-depth discussion, but for now, let's stay focused on the main topic at hand. One of the key points I'd like to highlight, especially for those familiar with Stoic philosophy, is the technical use of the term foolishness. In Stoicism, this term refers to one of the primary ways in which people exhibit moral failings. The Stoics believe that we should strive for wisdom and prudence, and failing to do so is essentially squandering our potential as human beings. Now, if we extend this idea to suggest that everyone who is foolish is also, in a sense, insane, we run into a logical conundrum. Using the transitive property, if moral badness equals foolishness, and foolishness equals insanity, then moral badness would also equal insanity. This is a bold claim that many might find hard to accept. The Stoics argue this point because, at its core, they believe that people inherently want to do what is good and beneficial for themselves. However, those who are considered foolish have a fundamental misunderstanding or flawed judgment about what truly constitutes good. As a result, they pursue actions they believe are good, even though these actions are actually contrary to their own well-being. This creates a situation where someone intends to do good but ends up doing harm, which could be seen as a form of insanity. To illustrate this, consider someone who knows stealing their neighbor's truck is wrong but decides to do it anyway, perhaps out of spite or for the thrill of committing a crime. On one level, they acknowledge the action is wrong, but they justify it by believing it serves a greater good, whether it's revenge or personal enjoyment. This is where the mistake lies. They think the wrong action is somehow good in this specific context. For example, they might rationalize it by thinking, "He deserves it," or "It's exciting to break the rules." While I can't speak for everyone, I remember as a kid thinking that the idea of committing crimes, as seen in shows like *The Dukes of Hazzard* or *The A-Team*, seemed appealing. However, that fascination likely wasn't rooted in a deep desire to commit crimes but rather in the excitement and adventure portrayed on screen. Still, it's an interesting example of how people can misinterpret what is truly good or beneficial. Let's consider the concept of the A-Team, a group of individuals who, despite being officially labeled as criminals, were portrayed as good guys because they fought against other criminals to correct injustices. This idea can be quite appealing, leading us to wonder if emulating such characters might be justified. For instance, take the TV show Dexter, where the protagonist is a serial killer with a strict moral code. He targets other serial killers, which might make one question whether his actions are acceptable. However, from a Stoic perspective, even if his actions serve a social purpose, he remains a serial killer, which is inherently wrong. This brings us to the story of Marcus Aurelius, who was learning about dealing with tyrants. There's a tale about a young man eager to kill a tyrant named Sulla, believing that doing so would make him a hero. However, his teacher had to caution him, as Sulla was known for his brutality and would likely retaliate against the young man's family. This illustrates the complexity of taking justice into one's own hands. Even if the act of killing a tyrant seems right, the person carrying it out might not be the right one, or their motives might be flawed. Consider the case of John Hinckley Jr., who attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan. His motive was to impress actress Jodie Foster, which is hardly a noble reason. This example highlights how even seemingly justified actions can be misguided if the motives are wrong. There are also instances where legitimate authorities fail to address tyranny or criminal behavior effectively. In such cases, one might wonder if it would have been better for someone else, perhaps a law enforcement officer, to intervene. This raises questions about who is truly qualified to take action against wrongdoing and whether failing to do so makes them complicit. These scenarios show the complexity of moral and ethical decision-making, especially when it involves taking justice into one's own hands. I have a bit of a family connection that I find intriguing, particularly when it comes to my uncle's father, who I never had the chance to meet. This relationship raises a question for me: does that make him my uncle's grandfather, or is there a more complex term for it? Regardless, I've heard many stories about him, and he sounds like he was quite an impressive individual. He served as an Indiana state trooper for several years, a role that was particularly perilous during his time. Back in those days, troopers often worked alone, without a partner by their side, and if they needed backup, it could take a significant amount of time, sometimes up to half an hour, to arrive. One story that stands out involves a man who had a history of committing violent crimes, though he had not yet taken a life. The details are a bit hazy in my memory, but I believe he was in a situation where he was pursuing his wife. My uncle's father, the state trooper, found himself in a position where he could have used lethal force against this individual. He recognized that he could provoke the man into a confrontation which would have justified a deadly response, and he was aware that he could likely escape any repercussions for such an action. However, he wrestled with his conscience and ultimately decided against taking that route. He believed it was important to adhere to the law and not act outside of it, even though a part of him felt that this might have been a justified moment for lethal action. Instead of resorting to violence, he chose to let the man go, issuing a stern warning about staying within legal boundaries. Tragically, within a week, that same man went on to murder his wife. Years later, my uncle's father recounted this incident to me, reflecting on it with a sense of regret. Even after 3 decades, he expressed that he felt he should have taken the opportunity to stop the man. He turned to me for my thoughts on the matter, knowing that I was studying philosophy and teaching ethics at the time. I told him that, given the circumstances he described, I could understand why he felt that way. He was always straightforward and honest, and it was clear that this incident had left a lasting impact on him. It's a complex moral dilemma, one that challenges the very foundations of our justice system. Ideally, we strive to ensure that law enforcement officers are not the ones to act as judge, jury, and executioner. Instead, we believe that every individual deserves a fair trial in front of a jury of their peers to determine guilt or innocence. This situation also brings to mind themes from science fiction, such as the concept of pre-crime depicted in The Minority Report, where authorities can predict and prevent crimes before they occur. But what if the opposite had happened? What if my uncle's father had chosen to use lethal force, and the outcome had been different? These are the kinds of questions that provoke deep ethical discussions. You might never have realized whether he would truly behave in the manner he did. However, the fact that he chose to release him while adhering to the principles of the law suggests that he did not pursue other options. Perhaps he could have fabricated some charges against him and placed him within the legal system for a while, which might have provided him with an alternative course of action. Yet, I doubt that this was a feasible option for him, or perhaps it simply wasn't something he considered or felt comfortable doing. Now, let's revisit the core of this discussion and delve into the actual paradox. Cicero begins with an ancient Greek phrase and then offers a Latin translation. The Greek phrase is ha un minute, while the Latin version is om stum in re. There are several translations available. Egmont translates it as, every fool is a madman, Rackham interprets it as, every foolish man is mad, and a more contemporary translator, Mark Webb, states it as, every fool is insane. Additionally, there's another translation found in a Wikipedia article that claims, all fools are mad. It's interesting to note that terms like insane and mad are essentially synonyms and convey similar meanings. However, there's a curious distinction that I don't want to overemphasize. In both the Greek and Latin versions, the term describing the foolish individual is merely an adjective. For instance, stupid in Latin and aphron in Greek both mean foolish. In contrast, the terms for being insane or crazy are verbs, indicating that these individuals do insane things rather than simply being labeled as insane. I find it challenging to convey this nuance effectively. One might say they engage in crazy behavior, or perhaps they act in a crazed manner, which could be another way to express it. I appreciate this distinction because it aligns with our discussions about the positive and negative aspects of Stoicism, which we often categorize as virtuous or vicious actions. Generally, we don't label someone as entirely virtuous or vicious. Instead, we recognize that they have performed virtuous or vicious deeds. We frequently focus on the actions individuals take rather than assigning an overarching value to their character. While it's possible to say someone tends to act in a certain way, labeling them as virtuous or vicious sets a very high standard that is difficult to meet unless you have spent considerable time with that person. After all, someone might perform actions that seem to stem from virtue, only to later reveal that their motivations were driven by a desire for money, prestige, or the need to impress someone. Alternatively, a person might engage in virtuous actions out of guilt for their past wrongdoings, seeking to prove to themselves that they are a good person. However, I'm not sure if that truly qualifies as being virtuous. It may indicate that they are on the right path. As the saying goes, you are what you repeatedly do. Let's explore a fascinating aspect of virtue ethics through a thought-provoking scenario. Imagine a young man who commits a grave mistake. Perhaps he gets into a fight that unintentionally leads to someone's death. He feels an overwhelming sense of guilt but manages to keep this incident a secret. No one knows what he has done. This situation is reminiscent of a true crime story, where many crimes go unsolved, as we often see in real life. The young man lives in the same town as the victim's family, and he witnesses their profound grief. This prompts him to consider whether he should come forward and confess. However, he decides against it. Instead, he resolves to engage in socially beneficial activities to somehow atone for his actions. He begins to help the victim's parents by shoveling their driveway, mowing their lawn, and providing comfort as they reminisce about their son, who they believe was a good person. In this way, he becomes like a surrogate son to them, performing virtuous acts. The question arises, at what point does he cross a threshold where these actions, initially motivated by guilt, become a genuine part of his character? Should he eventually stop feeling the internal turmoil of remorse and simply do good deeds because they are the right thing to do? As he continues to volunteer at local organizations, such as the Lions Club, and engages in various acts of kindness, like teaching children crafts or walking dogs, he begins to embody these virtuous behaviors. This scenario can also be applied to soldiers who have committed acts they regret during war, highlighting the complexity of human morality. The young man's deception in hiding his past complicates his journey toward virtue, as hiding can perpetuate a cycle of guilt and dishonesty. However, if he reaches a point where these good deeds become second nature, without the constant reminder of his past, we could argue that he is indeed acting virtuously. His actions would then reflect a true change in character, as long as his motivation shifts from mere repentance to a genuine desire to do good. The challenge lies in defining when someone can be considered virtuous or vicious, as human beings are inherently complex. Most individuals grapple with their own moral dilemmas, and it is this complexity that makes us care about their stories. Let's revisit the discussion about Cicero's *Cato*. This particular passage is somewhat different from other parts because Cicero offers very little detailed explanation. Mostly, he spends his time engaging in a rhetorical debate against an unnamed adversary, whom we can reasonably assume to be Clodius Pulcher. Clodius was a notorious political enemy of Cicero, known for causing Cicero's exile at one point. He was deeply connected to the aristocratic circles but tried to curry favor with the common people by deliberately changing his name to sound more of a lower-class origin, appealing to the plebeians, those from the lower social orders. This approach of appealing to the masses brings to mind the tactics used by Julius Caesar, though he was quite different in nature. While Caesar also had aristocratic roots, he often sought the support of the commoners, especially his soldiers, whom he built strong bonds with. This connection with his troops is what helped him cross the Rubicon in a famous act of defiance against the Senate and Pompey. In contrast, Marius was more like Clodius in some ways, particularly because his motivation was genuine concern for the common people. Marius genuinely aimed to improve circumstances for the average citizen, which led to conflicts with Sulla. Sulla, on the other hand, was ruthless. He even had Marius tortured. Cicero mentions such conflicts in his work *De Officiis*, where he discusses morality and justice. From a moral perspective, Caesar might also be viewed as a villain, suspected both for overthrowing the Republic and for his personal inclinations. Some critics believed he was fundamentally an Epicurean at heart, driven by a pursuit of pleasure and comfort, traits that made him suspect in the eyes of traditional Roman moral standards. Returning to Cicero's points, he emphasizes that the individual he describes isn't merely foolish or wicked, as many people tend to be. Instead, he suggests that such a person is truly insane, out of their mind, possibly both foolish and wicked, but fundamentally irrational. Cicero refers to the mind of a wise person being fortified by virtues, particularly magnanimity or high-mindedness, patience in enduring fortune, tolerance, and contempt for trivial human concerns. These virtues act as mental walls that defend against corrupt influences. One particularly interesting observation Cicero makes is that a truly wise individual cannot be banished from a political community because, by the time such an exile occurs, that community essentially ceases to truly exist. This suggests that a wise person is integral to the very essence or fabric of the community itself, making their exclusion almost impossible without destroying the community's integrity. What do you think of this argument? I find it quite clever. It implies that wisdom and virtue are so central to a community's life that removing a wise person would undermine everything that makes that community meaningful. He was exiled, and his response was something like, "You can't exile me." It's akin to a situation where someone attempts to terminate your employment, and your reaction is, "You can't fire me, I quit." That's a similar sentiment. He's essentially crafting a definition of a political community, one that is comprised of wise individuals. In his view, no community of wise people would ever expel another wise person from its ranks. So, according to his definition, it's inherently impossible to dismiss a wise individual, a group to which he, of course, considers himself a member. Consequently, he argues that he cannot be banished, because if he were, it would contradict the very definition of a wise counsel. He even goes so far as to say that when he was forced to leave, the Roman political community or state ceased to be a true state. It might have continued to exist officially, but in his eyes, it lost its legitimacy. This raises an interesting question. If we apply this same logic to our current situation, can we truly say we are living in a genuine political community today? That's a thought-provoking point. It seems there are individuals in positions of power who genuinely strive to do what they believe is best for the general populace, the common good, the welfare of the ordinary people. However, there are also those who are motivated by a desire for power, or perhaps they are enticed by the prospect of lucrative opportunities in the private sector after their time in public office. They might not even have to wait until their term ends. Lobbyists are often more than willing to provide substantial financial incentives. It appears that many people are significantly enriching themselves through political office these days. These practices hardly align with the principles of virtue, do they? From a Stoic perspective, if the actions undertaken by a political actor, someone with actual power and influence, are not geared towards the common good but rather serve the interests of a specific group, party, or class, then those actions are considered vicious and unjust. This is a valid point. Unfortunately, we don't gain as much insight from Cicero's explanation of this particular paradox as we did from his analysis of the others. So, what are we to make of this situation? We can extract some valuable information about the nature of a wise person. We can conclude that they actively participate in wisdom, which implies that they have dedicated considerable effort to cultivating their minds. They have also developed strong defenses in the form of virtues. So, in addition to qualities like magnanimity and endurance, they possess genuine courage, temperance, and a strong sense of justice. Cicero specifically mentions the things that Stoics regard as true goods, the qualities that reside within ourselves. These are aspects that can never be taken away from a wise individual. For instance, a person can be exiled, but the exiled individual hasn't truly lost anything of real value. This is a useful point he's trying to convey, and it ties directly into the concept that every foolish person is, in a sense, insane. That perspective makes sense. And I appreciate the emphasis on the political community. I don't typically think of myself primarily as a citizen, a member of the political community. I usually define myself based on my roles and the relationships I have with others. Engaging with others is certainly significant, isn't it? In our society, for instance, if you were in ancient Rome, your ability to influence political matters might be quite limited. This could be due to not being a Roman citizen or lacking a specific role within the political structure. If you weren't part of the aristocracy or the equestrian class, which held considerable power due to their social status, your voice might go unheard. Even if you possessed exceptional intelligence, it wouldn't guarantee you access to the political arena. However, in our contemporary society, there exists a pathway for individuals to make their voices heard and exert influence, regardless of their background. If you belong to a community that extends beyond just friends or family, such as a workplace or an educational institution, you are essentially part of a political community. While the scope may differ from traditional politics, the essence remains the same: you are contributing to the common good. This raises an interesting question about how we define politics. Politics can be seen as the process of making decisions that are accepted by a larger group, even if that group is relatively small. When we look at the origins of the term political, in Greek or Latin, we find that it can also be interpreted as a social. This broader interpretation might make the concept more accessible. For example, Aristotle famously stated that a man is a political animal. The Greek term used here, politikon, doesn't solely refer to politics in the way we typically understand it, it also encompasses the idea of living within a community. Thus, it can be translated as a man is a social animal. Additionally, there's a phrase that suggests this social nature is intrinsic to our being. The Stoics also believe that humans possess social instincts that set us apart from other social creatures. Unlike bees or ants, whose societies operate on instinctual programming, we have the capacity to come together and hold each other accountable. For instance, if someone in our community acts unjustly, we can collectively decide to remove them from their position, a concept that doesn't apply to ant colonies where the queen remains unchallenged. Interestingly, there are instances among ants where worker ants may choose to disengage from their duties, opting instead to remain in the hive and consume resources without contributing. This behavior can be likened to freeloading, where they benefit from the community without participating in its upkeep. Such dynamics highlight the complexities of social structures, both in human societies and in the animal kingdom. When we talk about freeloaders, it's interesting to consider an analogy that compares an ant colony to a single, large organism rather than a collection of individual ants. In this view, certain ants behave like tumors within our own bodies. These ants choose not to collaborate with the rest of the colony. Instead, they pursue their own interests, consuming resources that would benefit the entire colony. This concept is echoed in the writings of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, who discuss a Greek term that refers to tumors. They suggest that when we act against the greater good of the community we belong to, we are behaving like a tumor. Marcus Aurelius even connects this idea to feelings of anger towards others, which leads us to a relevant point made by Seneca, who stated that anger is a brief form of insanity. Now, what does foolishness entail? To understand this, we can contrast it with wisdom. Wisdom encompasses many aspects, and while I don't want to delve too deeply into the various distinctions made by the Stoics, it's helpful to touch on a few key points. Wisdom is not merely about contemplating lofty ideals, it is fundamentally about practical living. It involves discerning what actions we should take, what we should avoid, and understanding what truly matters in life. This includes recognizing the realm of indifference, which refers to things that are neither good nor bad, and distinguishing between what is genuinely beneficial and what is harmful. To be foolish, then, means to be misinformed or mistaken regarding these important distinctions. This makes sense when we observe people making poor decisions. We often find ourselves wondering, what were you thinking? When they explain their reasoning, we can pinpoint where they went wrong and identify factual inaccuracies in their thought process. The underlying idea is that we all strive to make the best choices possible. However, if someone misunderstands what constitutes the best choice, they inevitably end up pursuing a path that is not optimal. Consider petty criminals, for instance. They may experience a temporary high from their actions, especially if they are somewhat successful in their endeavors. They often display a certain level of intelligence in some areas, yet they overlook significant factors that could lead to their downfall. For example, if someone decides to shoplift expensive items and manages to do so discreetly, they might think they can continue this behavior indefinitely. However, eventually, the store will notice the loss of merchandise and take action to stop it. This scenario highlights the importance of strategic thinking. It's crucial to consider the long-term consequences of our actions, rather than just focusing on immediate gains. When we think about warfare, it's common to hear people exclaiming about new weapons that are supposedly game changers. However, history has shown us that no weapon can truly alter the course of everything, not even atomic bombs. There are always countermeasures developed to neutralize any weapon system. A pertinent example of this can be seen in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where some individuals express frustration over advanced NATO tanks being destroyed. They might say, these tanks are meant to be invincible. But the reality is that no weapon system is without vulnerabilities. If you take a moment to think critically, you'll realize that wise strategists always consider potential counteractions. To illustrate this point further, let's consider market bubbles. When people observe prices rising, they often rush to invest, believing they are making a sound decision. However, they fail to recognize that if everyone shares this mindset, the market will eventually become saturated, leading to a decline in value. If you happen to be the last person to buy in at the peak, thinking, it's only going to keep going up, you may find yourself in a precarious situation when the bubble bursts. It's essential to ask yourself, what if everyone else is thinking the same way I am? Unfortunately, many individuals do not take this into account, which can lead to poor financial decisions. While this may not be morally wrong in itself, it can become problematic if your choices negatively impact those who depend on you, especially if you're investing in something as frivolous as tulip bulbs. A historical example of misguided speculation is the infamous cabbage market cornering that occurred over a century ago. A man bought up all the cabbages in the United States, which ultimately drove many farmers out of business. In a bizarre twist, he dumped the surplus cabbages into the Chicago River, creating a surreal scene of floating vegetables. While this might sound amusing, it raises questions about the cleanliness of the river and the implications of such actions. Returning to the theme of wisdom, Cicero once described wisdom as being aligned with the pursuit of truth. In various aspects of our lives, we often categorize information as either true or false. The quest for truth is an intrinsic part of human nature and is closely tied to wisdom. When individuals act foolishly, they often fail to think things through completely. It's possible to possess exceptional technical skills yet still lack common sense in other areas. This disconnect is something we frequently observe in people who excel in specific fields but struggle to apply that same level of critical thinking in broader contexts. Understanding how to interact with others can be quite challenging, especially when individuals fail to consider the broader context of their actions. It's essential to recognize that qualities like prudence and wisdom are crucial in our lives today. As previously mentioned, the Stoics often hold a rather pessimistic view regarding the effort required to attain virtue. This suggests that achieving true wisdom may not be as straightforward as many of us believe. In fact, it's possible that some of us overestimate our wisdom and, in reality, act foolishly. According to this paradox, such behavior could be seen as a form of madness. To illustrate this point, consider the pursuit of eudaimonia, which refers to a state of happiness or flourishing. If your actions are misguided and lead you away from this goal, you might be acting irrationally. This irrationality can manifest in various ways, from the exaggerated antics of a cartoon character like Bugs Bunny, who might be depicted with a pot on his head, to more subtle mistakes that arise from a lack of careful thought. An intriguing comparison has been made between what are termed summer fools and winter fools. A summer fool is easily recognizable. They might be the person running around without clothes, covered in paint, and behaving erratically during the warm months. In contrast, a winter fool is less obvious. Imagine someone coming in from the snow. They first stamp their feet to remove snow from their boots, then shake their coat to get rid of the snow on it. However, in doing so, they inadvertently get snow back on their boots and coat, demonstrating a lack of foresight and counterproductive behavior. I've certainly found myself in situations where I acted like a winter fool, getting in my own way due to poor planning. This raises an interesting question: does such behavior automatically equate to insanity? How do we reconcile this idea? For instance, I have been diagnosed with mild depression since my youth, and my condition hovers between mild and moderate. The assessment I received was based on a poorly designed inventory, where scores ranged from 0 to 50 for mild depression, 50 to 100 for moderate, and 100 to 150 for severe depression. I scored exactly 50, leaving me uncertain about whether I fall into the mild or moderate category, akin to trying to determine whether a cat is shooed or not. The person who referred me, well, you could see he wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed despite being a psychiatrist. He seemed genuinely perplexed about which category to place me in. I responded with something like, "I don't have a preference, just make a random selection. You're the medical professional here, not me." Eventually, he settled on classifying my condition as a mild. This raises an interesting question. From a Stoic philosophical standpoint, does having a diagnosed mental health condition mean I'm fundamentally incapable of achieving true virtue? What about individuals with ADHD or someone with OCD who simply feels compelled to verify their door locks each evening before bed? Are such people inherently prevented from measuring up to Stoic ideals? I believe most of us would reject that notion. However, we should acknowledge that certain psychological conditions might create significant obstacles to developing Stoic virtues like wisdom. For instance, if someone struggles with severe anxiety disorders, can they truly cultivate the virtue of courage? That's a fascinating philosophical question that I'm not fully qualified to address comprehensively. Considering the OCD example further, there's a novel by author John Green titled Turtles All the Way Down, featuring a protagonist with obsessive-compulsive disorder, partly inspired by Green's personal experience with OCD. The book vividly portrays how intrusive thoughts can make it extraordinarily challenging to perform desired actions. When these thoughts emerge, they are nearly impossible to dismiss. They persist relentlessly in one's consciousness. This could certainly prevent someone from taking appropriate action in critical moments because their mind is completely preoccupied with seemingly trivial matters, making it exceedingly difficult to fulfill their moral obligations. I recall an interesting comic I encountered on social media some time ago addressing intrusive thoughts. It depicted a woman asking her doctor if medication would help eliminate her intrusive thoughts. The doctor initially confirmed it would resolve the issue immediately. But then she clarified that these thoughts were actually telling her things like, "Don't harm these people," and "Treat others humanely," at which point the doctor quickly withdrew the prescription, saying, "No, you definitely need to keep having those particular intrusive thoughts." Regarding Stoicism overall, there are aspects I find quite appealing. I appreciate how Stoic philosophy doesn't shy away from directly confronting problematic behaviors and questionable motivations. With some Stoic paradoxes, I can generally align myself with their perspective. But this particular paradox suggesting that everyone who lacks wisdom, and is therefore morally flawed, must be insane. That's harder to accept, at least not in the extreme sense of complete detachment from reality. It sounds like a bold claim, but let's unpack it for a moment. Does every seemingly irrational action point to a diagnosed mental disorder? Probably not. I wouldn't apply the modern, clinical sense of the word insanity here. However, if we use a looser definition, say, repeatedly doing the same thing while expecting a different outcome, then I can see why someone might call that behavior insane. That's the spirit behind the so-called Stoics paradox in popular discussions, a deliberately provocative way to grab attention, much like a catchy marketing slogan. The wording may be dramatic, but underneath the hyperbole lies a familiar idea. People often repeat patterns, financial habits, relationship mistakes, even physical routines, hoping this time the results will change. Think of the classic doctor's joke: a patient raises his arm and says, "It hurts when I do this," and the doctor replies, "Then don't do that." The humor works because it highlights our tendency to cling to an unhelpful action instead of adjusting course. You may have heard the line, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results." The internet frequently credits Albert Einstein, yet a quick fact-check shows it most likely originated with novelist Rita Mae Brown in her 1983 mystery, Sudden Death. Over the years the phrase was paraphrased, misattributed, and eventually attached to Einstein, proof that even quotes can get stuck in repetitive loops. In any case, the core message rings true: real change demands new behavior. Persisting with the old while anticipating a fresh outcome is, at best, wishful thinking. That brings our chat to a close. I'll leave you with the words of Mrs. Ruse: ask an ordinary person whether they are intelligent or foolish, and you'll find not one will admit to being foolish. A fitting reminder that self-awareness is the first step to breaking those repeating cycles.